In the following selection, the audience meets Mary Maloney, who shares her experiences about one impulsive decision. The narrator asks the audience to think about a woman's split-second decision after receiving bad news and the irony that follows. Lamb to the Slaughter by Roald Dahl. The room was warm and clean, the curtains drawn, the 2 table lamps alight, hers and the one by the empty chair opposite. On the sideboard behind her, 2 tall glasses, soda water, whiskey. Mary Maloney was waiting for her husband to come home from work. Now and again she would glance up at the clock, but without anxiety, merely to please herself with the thought that each minute gone by made it nearer the time when he would come home. There was a slow, smiling air about her and about everything she did. The drop of a head as she bent over her sewing was curiously tranquil. Her skin, for this was her 6th month with child, had acquired a wonderful translucent quality. When the clock said 10 minutes to 5, she began to listen, and a few moments later, punctually as always, she heard the tires on the gravel outside, the car door slamming, the footsteps passing the window, the key turning in the lock. She laid aside her sewing, stood up, and went forward to kiss him as he came in. "Hello, darling," she said. "Hello, darling," he answered. She took his coat and hung it in the closet. Then she walked over and made the drinks, a strongish one for him, a weak one for herself, and soon she was back again in her chair with the sewing, and he in the other, opposite, holding the tall glass with both hands, rocking it till the ice cubes tinkled against the side. "Darling, would you like me to get you some cheese? I haven't made any supper because it's Thursday." "No," he said. "If you're too tired to eat out, it's still not too late. There's plenty of meat and stuff in the freezer, and you can have it all right here and not even move out of your chair." Her eyes waited on him for an answer, a smile, a little nod, but he made no sign. "Anyway, I'll get you some cheese and crackers first." "I don't want it," he said. She moved uneasily in her chair, the large eyes still watching his face. "But you must eat. I'll fix it anyway." She stood up and placed her sewing on the table by the lamp. "Sit down. Just for a minute, sit down." It wasn't until then that she began to get frightened. She lowered herself back slowly into her chair, watching him all the time with those large, bewildered eyes. He had finished the 2nd drink and was staring down into the glass, frowning. "Listen," he said. "I've got something to tell you." "What is it, darling? What's the matter?" And he told her. It didn't take long, 4 or 5 minutes at most, and she stayed very still through it all, watching him all the time with a kind of dazed horror as he went further and further away from her with each word. "So there it is," he added. "And I know it's kind of a bad time to be telling you, but there simply wasn't any other way. Of course, I'll give you money and see you're looked after, but there needn't be any fuss. It wouldn't be very good for my job." Her first instinct was not to believe any of it, to reject it all. It occurred to her that perhaps he hadn't even spoken, that she herself imagined the whole thing. Maybe, if she went about her business and acted as though she hadn't been listening, then later, when she sort of woke up again, she might find none of it had ever happened. "I'll get the supper," she managed to whisper, and this time he didn't stop her. When she walked across the room, she couldn't feel her feet touching the floor. She couldn't feel anything at all, except a slight nausea and a desire to vomit. Everything was automatic now. Down the steps to the cellar, the light switch, the deep freeze, the hand inside of the cabinet taking a hold of the first object it met. She lifted it out and looked at it. It was wrapped in paper, so she took off the paper and looked at it again. A leg of lamb. All right then, they would have lamb for supper. She carried it upstairs, holding the thin bone end of it with both her hands, and as she went through the living room, she saw him standing over by the window with his back to her, and she stopped. "For God's sake, don't make supper for me. I'm going out." At that point, Mary Maloney simply walked up behind him, and without any pause, she swung the big frozen leg of lamb high in the air and brought it down as hard as she could on the back of his head. She may as well have just hit him with a steel club. She stepped back a pace, waiting, and the funny thing was that he remained standing there for at least 4 or 5 seconds, gently swaying. Then he crashed to the carpet. The violence of the crash, the noise, the small table overturning, helped bring her out of the shock. She came out slowly, feeling cold and surprised, blinking at the body, still holding the ridiculous piece of meat tight with both hands. "All right," she told herself. "So I've killed him." It was extraordinary now how clear her mind became all of a sudden. She began thinking very fast. As the wife of a detective, she knew quite well what the penalty would be, but what about the child? What were the laws about murders of unborn children? Did they kill then both mother and child, or did they wait until the 10th month? Mary Maloney didn't know, and she certainly wasn't prepared to take a chance. Then she ran downstairs, took her coat, and went into the street. It wasn't 6 o'clock yet, and the lights were still on in the grocery shop. "Hello, Sam," she said brightly, smiling at the man behind the counter. "Why, good evening, Mrs. Maloney. How are you?" "I want some potatoes, please, Sam. Yes, and I think a can of peas. Patrick's decided he's tired and doesn't want to eat out tonight." "Then how about meat, Mrs. Maloney?" No, I've got meat, thanks. I got a nice leg of lamb from the freezer." And when it was all wrapped and she had paid, she put on her brightest smile and said, "Thank you, Sam. Good night." And now she told herself, as she hurried back, all she was doing now, she was returning home to her husband, and he was waiting for his supper, and she must cook it good and make it as tasty as possible, because the poor man was tired. And if, when she entered the house, she happened to find anything unusual or tragic or terrible, then naturally it would become a shock, and she became frantic with grief and horror. When she entered the kitchen by the back door, she was humming a little tune to herself and smiling. "Patrick," she called, "how are you, darling?" She put the parcel down on the table, and when she saw him lying there on the floor with his legs doubled up and one arm twisted back underneath his body, all the old love and longing for him welled up inside her. She knelt down beside him and began to cry her heart out. It was easy. No acting was necessary. A few minutes later, she got up and went to the phone. "Quick! Come quick! Patrick's dead! It's Mrs. Maloney. Mrs. Patrick Maloney. He's lying on the floor and I think he's dead." 4 policemen quickly arrived. "Is he dead?" she cried. "I'm afraid he is." "What happened?" Briefly, she told her story about going out to the grocer and coming back to find him on the floor. Her husband, he told her, had been killed by a blow on the back of the head administered with a heavy blunt instrument, almost certainly a large piece of metal. They were looking for the weapon. The murderer may have taken it with him, but on the other hand, he may have thrown it away or hidden it somewhere on the premises. "It's the old story," he said. "Get the weapon and you've got the man." The 4 men searching the room seemed to be growing wary, a trifle exasperated. "Look, Mrs. Maloney, you know that oven of yours is still on and the meat's still inside." "Oh, dear me," she cried. "So it is. Would you do me a small favor, you and these others?" "We can sure try, Mrs. Maloney." "Well, I know Patrick would never forgive me, God bless his soul, if I allowed you to remain in his house without offering you decent hospitality. Why don't you eat up that lamb that's in the oven? I'm sure it'll be cooked just right by now." "Wouldn't dream of it," Sergeant Noonan said. "Please eat it. Personally, I couldn't touch a thing, but it'd be a favor to me if you'd eat it up. Then you can go on again with your work afterwards." There was a good deal of hesitating among the 4 policemen, but they were clearly hungry, and in the end they were persuaded to go into the kitchen and help themselves. The woman stayed where she was, listening to them speaking among themselves, their voices thick and sloppy because their mouths were full of meat. "It's the hell of a big club that Gut must use to hit poor Patrick," one of them was saying. "The doc says his skull was smashed all to pieces, just like from a sledgehammer. That's why it ought to be easy to find. Personally, I think it's right here on the premises. Probably right under our very noses. What do you think, Jack?" And in the other room, Mary Maloney began to giggle.